This is already fun. And so what I'm gonna share some data with you with the idea that I think we've already talked a lot about, is reconciling the idea of intellectual property's exclusivity model with the university's obligation to both students and the world in terms of its knowledge production and dissemination. And so I think part of what makes universities different than any other entity that might amass intellectual property is that universities do have very specific mission-driven ideas to facts, as Yochai talks about, which we should not forget, facts and knowledge, but also to producing those students and alums who go out into the world and work. So with these principles in mind, I think one of my biggest takeaways is that intellectual property is a varied concept. That is, I think we so easily think about it as an economic chit, as an asset of some kind, and I think we really need to let ourselves think more broadly than that if we're going to solve what I think many of us identify as the problem of what universities are doing with intellectual property. So I'm going to share with you some accounts from 2 different faculty members and a TLO officer that was part of a big research project that I did with many different interviews. This data was not in the Eureka Myth, but the data was part of collecting it for the Eureka Myth. And these are accounts that describe how the TLO and the faculty members worked together, how it worked and how it didn't work, and how the TLO officers also worked with the rest of the world and how that functioned. And so what I'll just say as a cautionary tale, I'll just say, so these are only 3 stories, but it's qualitative data that should be taken as evidence of critical variables in the analysis that we should be conducting going forward. All right, so I'm going to tell you about Jack. So Jack is an award-winning computer scientist at a university with a very strong world-class reputation for academics and research. He's the named inventor on 9 patents, some of which were sold for as much as $100,000, and some became the basis of companies, one of which was sold for $30 million. He's been a professor a really long time. And he joined the department and became a computer scientist instead of going into business. He had a very lucrative job offer after grad school because he likes problem solving, he likes having autonomy, and the freedom to pursue a lot of the problems that interest him. And he describes the ventures that he engages in, these patents, as sort of a sideline, as sort of fun. And this is one of his stories about the TLO. That is, after 2 of my patents were rejected, on the first office action, the university's technology transfer office decided not to prosecute because a patent's like a publication. It costs them money, but nice to have reputation-wise. And then after a while, I stopped giving the university patents. It's a lot of work writing a patent with an attorney, and if they're not going to prosecute it, and if it doesn't get through the first office action, which is rare, so what do is I get them to release the rights for most of the things that I'm interested in. So I asked him if intrinsic motivation is key to him, why even bother with patents at all or try to sell them? He says that patents don't make money, startups do, and in order to do a startup, you need an ecosystem with a lot of business talent. So one of the things he might have been looking for in the TLO was that consulting feature, but that's not what the TLO was there for. And that's hard to do for most professors. There's some who pull it off, but mostly we're just a little too geeky. And I can tell you, he's very, very geeky, and he was looking for that kind of help with the TLO. And when I asked him, how would you fix the system? How could you make IP work for him, whether it's money or reputation or collaboration? He had a plan that looked very, very different from one we have today. He says, I want everything to possibly include the university for 10%. So your books, your online lectures, software licenses, your patents, your startups, everything you do that depends on your reputation as a professor, everything that relates to your profession that the university pays for. The university should be a passive holder of a 10th. So you imagine that if every poet who wrote a book that made $1,000 included the university on any royalty that exceeded $50,000 or something, and then you won the Pulitzer, all of a sudden all your books are now bestsellers, and the university would get the benefit from all those years that they paid for you to be a poet and teach a course. Now, I'm not endorsing this view at all. I'm just suggesting that these are the ways certain people think about their relationship to the university and the TLO. And when I asked what prevents, in his mind, the university from pursuing such a path, he said they see big numbers of healthcare-related patents dangling in front of their eyes. So this is the story, the cultural story that fogs, I think, a lot of what we're talking about. I still hope to have a home run someday, although one wonders why. My argument is that it would be a fair system that would value the intellectual property of all the humanities, still apply to sciences, and that it might be a bigger payoff because people have more incentives to actually get their work added to the world. So this kind of pooling and passive holding company model that rejects long-term relationship, that respects long-term relationships and equality between disciplines, and I think that imagines a mutual benefit of the university and the professor. It's non-discriminatory, it's flatter. It does a lot to offer from the perspective of upholding certain values of sharing and publication, and a fuzzier line between research and business, insofar as we think that line is already pretty fuzzy today. It's entirely unrealistic, as I understand. But I don't know why the values of a broader and flatter ownership model, if we're going to accept that ownership and property is part of our conversation today, although we don't have to. It's something to consider, I think, given the values and commitments that come with it. All right, so the next story is one of Robert. Robert is an award-winning theoretical chemist at a major research university. He also started a company with a software system that he's still trying to get off the ground. And he describes one of the tensions between what he does as an academic and what the TLO does is this way. He says, if you're a great department like this one, I mean, you have a lot of great people you get a lot of stimulation from. And then you go to conferences and you talk to people and you get stimulation from that. But the thing about academics is you can literally wake up one morning and say, you know, I'm not going to do X anymore. I'm going to start doing Y. And I actually did that a couple times. I mean, you know, I just woke up one day and I said, I've got to do X. And I dropped everything and started doing X. I mean, people can't force you to do very much as an academic. It's like feudalism. Because every tenured professor who has some sort of serious research effort is like a feudal lord. Which is to say, you know, the king could call upon the feudal lord and say, will you please send me some troops to go fight in the war? But he didn't have to. And similarly, if someone comes to my office and says, will you do X? It's a question. They're not telling me I have to do X. And if I feel like saying no, I could say no. So you might ask, what does this have to do with IP? I think it's based on this conception of ethics and what a professor and scholar is supposed to do and be in a university, and how that university is supposed to support them in return. Robert says that because of this feudal autonomy that he very much appreciates, that he has over his life, that there's a quid pro quo that he has to give back. He says, if you develop something that's really new and you think it's patentable, you're supposed to write an invention report. Now, obviously, it's a judgment call what qualifies as an invention report. However, the other thing that I feel is that anything that's done at the university, we're supposed to publish, okay? I mean, you can't make something that's done at the university into a trade secret. That's unethical. Not only is bad, not only are you taking money and doing something you shouldn't do, but it's bad for the student, because if you're concealing something that would help the student get a job, that's really totally unacceptable. So anything that we did at the university, we would write papers, we describe what we did, presumably to a point where people could reproduce it. The big idea is, you know, those things occasionally will come across something worth patenting, and so we would. So those were rare occasions in his world, and the default was to publish for the students, for the scientific community. Patenting was okay because it was a kind of publishing, but the principle was to disseminate. Very idealistic, I realize, but it's still an explanation provided for the kind of behavior, the quid pro quo, that the star scientist saw at the root of the professor-university relationship. So one last example from Susan. She's a TLO officer, and this is not about patents or copyrights. It's about trademarks. I don't know if we'll spend much time talking about it today, but my experience with in this data, and as I've been collecting more of it, is that universities are very, very bullish when it comes to their trademarks. They overclaim, and even when what's at stake is nominative or fair use or free speech, there's an attempt to grab as much as possible. So this is Susan. She's in a big university, TLO. So we control the university trademarks. We don't license for anything except college insignia, T-shirts, and beer mugs, and we will not license it to anyone for anything else. We have to be real careful when it's used on books and things, real control. We have to police it properly. It's primarily to protect a priceless asset. And here's one example that she told me about having been given the responsibility of the use of the name when Sony Pictures wanted to make a film. We didn't want to let them, even though it was, you know, there's a true story. It did happen here. We did not want to let them because we didn't want to be associated with that kind of picture. Well, so all of a sudden, this famous actor and a bunch of Sony camera trucks show up on the street across the university, and we get called, come get them, they're on campus. And we say, we told you, you can't do this. So they were on the sidewalk, and if you look at the movie, you'll see all the places on the sidewalk wherever it's actually shown. And she goes on, she has a lot of stories like this, maintaining control over the trademark in a way that, that for many trademark scholars would think really comes up against free speech and dissemination of truthful stories. So I think all these examples point to the question about whether, how an IP is a contestable feature of university culture, and that its roles tend to be quite flexible and built around relationships. And so I guess that means that we make choices about how IP as a legal object can function in our university. And I think that we can choose to make it function in particular ways differently than it might function outside universities. And I think we should think hard about how we do that.